Plants are now popping up on buildings more and more all over our cities, on facades, on roofs, on balconies and ledges. They can look stunning, yes, and turn our buildings into popular landmarks if and when given the proper care they need. So, what's the deal? How does that work? What are we actually getting from greening buildings? And what more could be achieved in the near future? Today, I speak with two experts in the fields of biophilic and biocentric design. Catie Balagtas from Terrapin Bright Green in New York City and Anuj Jain from bioSEA in Singapore. We look at the shift moving design thinking from purely decorative to high-performing landscapes.
15 years ago, the challenge was just getting people to pay attention to this relationship to the built environment, and then it evolved into
how do you actually increase the performance of the landscape?
What's the return on investment? Should we even be building here?
Does it help meet our sustainability goals? So that is a massive step forward.
And what might be the next level target on the horizon?
What else does this site do that would eventually get us to perform more like an intact ecosystem?
That's a lot harder to push. A lot of people ask, why care? Why me? Why should I pay? There has to be that buy-in at a bigger level.
Sooner is better because then there's the opportunity is greater.
Are we ready for that?
Thriving landscapes that benefit all life, mammals, birds, insects, our own included, right in the heart of our dense cities, could be transformative. How do we get the building sector to take the next logical step? This video is sponsored by the Holcim Foundation for Sustainable Construction. More on them later. So, Catie, Anuj, welcome to Ecogradia.
Thank you, Nirmal. It's great to be here.
Likewise. I've been looking forward to this for a while.
Now, I've known both of you for several years, but you've only just met, right?
Yes, actually. This is the first time that we've gotten to really dig in and chat and even see each other. So great to meet you, Anuj.
Likewise, and I've heard of Terrapin Bright Green for a while. It's lovely to meet you, Catie.
Well, I tell you what, to get us started, let me make a quick round of formal introductions. So, Catie, you're an environmental design consultant and an expert in the field of biophilic design. Your work sits at the intersection between nature, neuroscience, and architecture. You are director of projects at Terrapin Bright Green, a New York-based consultancy. Anuj, you are the founding director of bioSEA, a Singapore-based consultancy that steers the design construction sector towards ecological design. Now, you have a background in wildlife conservation, but these days you are focused on bringing nature into the city. You are both, in your own ways, challenging ideas about architecture, about the 21st century city. You're asking how buildings, landscapes, and neighborhoods become healing and regenerative. Tell me, what's the hardest part of your job? Catie?
I'd say the hardest part has actually evolved over time. Initially, say like 15 years ago, maybe a little bit more, the challenge was just getting people to pay attention to the idea of bringing nature in or just caring about it and its relationship to the built environment. And then it evolved into like, what's the economic argument? What's the return on investment? And then more recently, it's like, well, how do we do this? How much is too much or not enough?
Sure. Now, Anuj, you and I have to make the same argument except to an Asian audience. What's the hardest part of what you have to do?
Well, coincidentally, quite similar. Traditionally, a lot of design briefs don't have ecologists cut out in the role. So it's hard to convince a client, why even engage us and why even pay us for that matter. A lot of the thinking has been to bring nature and think of it as a healer for humans, for well-being. But given we want to push the boundaries for biocentric design, we want to look at life for its own sake, that's a lot harder to push. A lot of people ask, why care? Why me? Why should I pay?
I wanted to have a conversation on nature-centric design in part out of frustration. So I had a recent encounter with a green building expert who was showing me around a new low-rise office building in Singapore that is situated next to a forested area. Before construction, the project team removed all the vegetation on the site. But he explained it away, saying that there are now, in place of what was there, indoor pocket gardens. I mean, in the conversation that we had, there was no awareness of the value of ecosystems that had been lost. Instead, in the conversation on green building design, nature had become a number. How many trees have we planted? I have a problem with this approach, and I think you do too. And I'd like us, to unpack this problem. Yeah. But before we get into the discussion, let's break it down a little bit. When it comes to nature and architecture, there are many words floating around today. What do they actually mean? Starting with biophilic. Catie, how would you define biophilic design?
Well, I mean, we typically default to Edward Wilson's definitions, or one of his definitions, that it's humankind's innate connection with living things and organisms. So when we're talking about biophilic design, there's that, whether it's intentional or intuitive incorporation of nature for the benefit of our health and well-being.
I like to make a distinction between biophilic and biocentric design. In the former, biophilic design, my view is about the human perception of nature, our innate connection, as Catie described. For biocentric design or ecological design, the focus is on nature itself. And how do we play out or optimize the performative aspects of nature such that it serves itself and it serves us?
I think we're quite used to today seeing, plants on buildings, sometimes decorative, but sometimes with biophilic intent, right? So when does it cross the line into biocentric?
That's a great question. And I think it stems so deep into our understanding of what is nature and our connection to it. Because a lot of design stems out from the fact that that nature is there to just heal us and for our benefit, starting with indoor plants. Whereas biocentric design looks at the whole ecosystem, the interactions of different organisms, flora and fauna with itself to the physical environment. What do they need? What does a butterfly need to thrive in that ecosystem? It could be a certain type of nectar plants, caterpillar plants, resting spots, so on and so forth. So how do we create that ecosystem that provides an habitat for this animal to survive, thrive, and breed in this place alongside us? And that is a massive step forward, not just kind of thinking inside the box, but opening the windows and thinking outside.
Catie, there's another term that, gets used a lot, and I'm wondering if you could tease it apart for us. Regenerative design. How do the words biophilic and biocentric or nature-centric design fits within this larger concept of regenerative design thinking?
In my perspective, I would say that biophilia is a stepping stone to biocentric, which is on its way to regenerative.
Right, they're embedded.
Yeah.
Maybe I can respond to that by adding biophilic design would perhaps look at how we interact with nature. But when we talk about regenerative, this becomes more performative by definition, whereby we are saying, what did this land do before, and can we regenerate its function, its performance, to make it greater than what it was in the past.
So I've met architects in the past, who often say that buildings and nature are inherently different, right? A human-made object is not natural by its very definition. So there is behind this kind of implicit dichotomy of authentic and inauthentic nature. I mean, we can't replicate nature, authentic nature. Right. I think it's important for us to unpack these assumptions that lead to mindsets. So let's go back to the definitions for a minute. First of all, what is the definition of nature?
For me, it's about the interaction of different organisms, the living forms on the planet that sustain us. In the broadest sense, and the environment that it needs to thrive.
My definition would be a little wider than that. I would include abiotic And rocks are beautiful. So I think it's to me it's a little bit more encompassing. But if we're going to be talking about biocentric, we have to be thinking about the atmosphere and beyond, all of that.
There is another term that we often use in this conversation on nature-centric design, which is ecosystems. Can you break that down for me? What do we mean by an ecosystem? Anuj?
Yeah, so an ecosystem is about the community interacting with the physical environment and the community of organisms, the flora and the fauna.
Can you give a few examples of what a constructed ecosystem looks like?
There are many examples in Singapore. We've worked with Wuha architects for a while, and a good example would be Kampung Admiralty. This is a multi-use building in the northern western part of Singapore that brings together the elderly, the healthcare, the food, public space, etc.
It is a project that, by its very form and intent, seeks to create an ecosystem, a habitat for flora and fauna. I want to talk a little bit about this because I think it's really important for architects out there who are listening to understand that this is not just a question of putting a few trees around a building and hoping for the best, right? That it could be a more active role that they play in facilitating the birth and the growth and the sustenance of an ecosystem.
And if you look at Kampung Admiralty from a bird's eye view, it almost looks like a hill, a natural hill that has plants from the bottom all the way in a stacked manner rising to the very top. And until I saw that building, couldn't imagine that's possible. In a dense neighborhood, which is surrounded by a lot of rocks and multifunctional. So there is clearly something about the form that was done differently, while achieving the right GFA, the right economic proposition for the place, etc. Now this building is 10 stories high. There is greenery on the ground, a bit of a break in between, and then it restarts again from the 6th floor. So 6 to 10 is contiguous with tall trees, such that the canopy of one level touches the ground of the other level. And so you have this continuous plane where, birds fly, we've recorded fruit bats, we've recorded predators, we've recorded overall actually 213 species from this building, which is crazy, mind-boggling. And it truly creates a form that rivals natural parks, pocket parks in its neighborhood. So I think it's a great example of how form should actually, be thought about from the very beginning, and nature shouldn't be left, to the very end. I've completed the form, and then here you go, go plant some trees.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Anuj, I don't know if you remember, but we did this little exploratory article once a long time ago where I think that the article was titled "How a Bird Sees It," and it was all about the different shapes of buildings and how is the building perceived to be a cave or a cliff or a plateau, or is it a hill? There is this kind of buildings become analogs for things that happen in nature, and it doesn't guarantee that an ecosystem will be born. But if we begin to see buildings as analogs of nature, then it's a first step towards positioning the architecture as a substrate for some living system to exist.
Exactly. It's one of my favorite articles to date, and we've actually developed a whole nature-centric design framework around that. So to just explain a little bit, we've looked at where is greenery possible on buildings and how does that draw a parallel with natural forms. So if you're thinking of a green wall that is similar to a cliff, and no doubt you see animals that are very comfortable in cliffs or on cliffs in nature actually take to green walls very easily because it's their natural habitat. Good examples are the pigeons. Right? Pigeons are happy in the cities because their natural habitat is the cliffs in Mediterranean. And when you give a building ledge on it, it's perfectly happy. So there is a lot of benefit in looking at that approach.
I have a question for you on that matter. I know a couple architects here in New York, like Bro-Happold and Cook Fox, have done experimental work on building facades or facade design or concept design that is actually designed to support specific species. And I'm wondering if that kind of work has been done or implemented at scale, at any scale, in Singapore, where it's like meant to attract and retain species of bees or birds or bats.
Definitely. I think there has been a lot of work thinking about what kinds of plants can sustain and different kinds of heights, densities, shade, slash light, or wind conditions.
Biophilic design has proven itself to have a return on investment, right? So, if you have an environment that is therapeutic or that people are comfortable or feel well in, that elevates the perceived value of that real estate, right? I mean, we pay a lot more for hotel rooms with a sea view than we do for a city view. It's already economically based. The challenge is in biocentric design. How do we then put a value to this proposition of creating ecosystems?
And I have an example in New York that it looks at water specifically that I think is worth sharing. The 111 8th Avenue in the Chelsea neighborhood, West Chelsea, New York City, in Manhattan, is a 1930s, I think it was built in 1932, big brick building. It's the size of a New York City block. So that's 200 feet by 800 feet. It's about 15 stories high, plus some penthouses on either side of the building. It's enormous. It's 2.9 million square feet of office space. It was a huge, it had a huge energy utility bill, and was purchasing 119 million gallons of water a year, but then discharging like 143 million gallons. So a team of engineers and Terrapin and a bunch of others dug in to figure out what's going on in this building. And we were working with Eric Sanderson, who's now at the New York Botanical Gardens. At the time, he was mapping out the history of New York City and Manhattan, particularly to understand the different ecosystems of the city based on old maps. So we did an overlay with these maps from 1609, around that era, and discovered that there was a stream that ran right through the building. And so that stream was pouring between 250, 300 million gallons, almost like 1,000 liters of water per minute into the basement, and then getting discharged to the sewer every day. And so when it was discovered that this water was so clean, we realized all the different uses for it, because it had to go somewhere. So using it back, putting it into the building systems, we were able to drastically cut all different costs and more dynamic water flow system. But it also brought us to question, well, what else does this site do or provide for us that can benefit the building owners, but also just the urban environment and nature? And so we looked at what an intact forest or landscape would be on that site or in that neighborhood based on Eric Sanderson's research. And understood what the carbon cycle, nutrient cycle, water flows, energy flows, solar, and then devised, okay, well, if this is how an intact ecosystem would perform, how can those metrics and that data be translated into building metrics? And how can we then devise a plan that would eventually get us to perform more like the ecosystem, an intact ecosystem?
Mm-hmm.
Anuj, you've done a lot of this benchmarking as well. The idea of intact ecosystems, what was there before as a point of reference for what needs to be. And I think, I read the ecocentric framework that you did with Woha. I mean, you actually compared several Woha buildings with the intact ecosystem.
That's right.
So what did you find with the buildings, and what did it then mean practically?
As Janine Benyus puts it, a sustainable world already exists. Why are we looking for this holy grail when it's already out there? And so, by the same line of thought, we've created this framework in which the site or the target building, if it sits in the center, we often create two extremes scenarios. The first scenario would be the natural forest or the primary forest, pristine habitat that might exist in that space, and what are the different ecosystem services or biodiversity that it may provide. So that's a good benchmark and ambition. The other would be a business as usual scenario. It could be a typical building in the neighborhood, that could be an energy guzzler, or perhaps the existing design if you're looking at a renovation. So for this framework, we looked at parks within half a kilometer from each building. 5 projects in total, so 5 parks and 5 other business as usual buildings, similar typologies. And we looked at it by many different themes. First being biodiversity. So we did biodiversity surveys to quantify the performance of each typology. And mind you, they were all similar sizes, so the results were comparable. Then did the same thing with ecosystem services. We put in sensors, so we measured the temperature performances, different locations in the building. We also did simulations to calculate what is the simulated performative benefit for all the services we talked about: air, water, carbon, etc., etc. And then the social aspects as well. If you walk into this biophilic, biocentric building, how are people feeling about it? And through that, we could then actually create a building scoring framework, which allowed us to look at ground greenery, vertical greenery, and which one should be rewarded, why, and how does that come together into some kind of a scoring system.
Coming up, Catie and Anuj discuss how they would kickstart a project. What are the key questions they would ask up front? Also, how can designers align biocentric matters with other targets usually defined at the drawing board? But first, let me quickly tell you about the world's most significant competition for sustainable design, with a total prize pool of $1 million, the Wholesome Foundation Awards. Francis Carey, the acclaimed architect, won the Global Gold Award in 2012. Prior to winning, few had heard of him, and since, his profile has skyrocketed. At Ecogradia, we celebrate award winners like Carey. This year, we're spotlighting the 2023 winners in an exclusive webinar series. And who knows, next year, you might well be a part of this inspiring group of changemakers. The portal for online submissions for the next cycle of the Wholesome Foundation Awards is now open, and it will stay open until February 2025. It's free. Find out more in our show notes or at awards.wholesomefoundation.org. If I could sort of put you in a role right now with this architect, green expert person that I met who rattled my cage, who showed me this project that lost the forest but then planted a few indoor gardens. Let's say you're on that team, right? what would you do as a first step? What would be the first thing that you would recommend? How do we begin this process of accounting and modifying and calibrating our response to that?
This is a recurring question. One of the first questions we often ask is like, should we even be building here?
Right.
And in certain cases, we've found that, and that's whether there's an intact forest or what have you, or if it's a complete desert where there aren't resources that you might need, like fresh water. Should we be building here? And oftentimes we come to this conclusion that, well, if we're not on this team, somebody else is going to do it. And it might not be done as well or as responsibly. So unfortunately, that's often like the rationale for participating in something that we don't necessarily think is the best solution. But when you can't have the best solution, what's your next option?
Right.
My first step would be to really try to engage the team in understanding the site before, during that first planning and concept, take them to the site. A lot of architects never actually get a chance to experience the site before something's built on it, and see what's going on there. What kind of wildlife. And I think you'll end up, irrespective of that idea of biocentrism, I think you'll still end up with a more interesting project.
Some clients would reach out to us when they see a forest and like, oh, what do we do here? Should we cut it all? Should we retain parts of it? Help us unpack this. So we would start with almost the same process that Katie described, whereby we'd start looking at the site potential. We could also go in there, do biodiversity surveys to actually quantify, given the time and budgets that might allow, to create a baseline inventory. What do you have at site that you can actually retain and enhance?
So let's say you've done the audits, you've done the site analysis, you've done the benchmarking. What's next? Where do we go? The question I'm asking is, how do we flip from the descriptive to the prescriptive?
There are very simple principles of good ecological design, if I may say. And, we should start with at least having a small pocket of spontaneous vegetation, wild vegetation, if you will. In every project we do, we're always fighting for that. And then testing the appetite of the architect, the client. And more than space, it's often a matter of mindset. If we say, how about this, 10 square meter of land that, we just let a forest grow in it, it's small, but then, there'll be questions about, oh my God, how are we going to maintain it? What if it grows unsightly? What if it has some things that we don't want them to be there, etc. And by design, we can manage that because we want to create these nodes, hotspots where nature can thrive, and then kind of create corridors such that nature is connected, have as much ground greenery as possible, multi-tiered landscapes, reducing edge effects, because as soon as you start creating edges, you only get a certain kind of diversity. So all these principles are well laid out in the literature, and anybody working in the space would know it.
From a biophilic design perspective, people fixate on the patterns. That's what we often talk about. It's like the 14 patterns of biophilic design, and there's other frameworks for that, of course. And the idea of patterns and principles are often confounded. And the principles of biophilic design are distinct, more universally applicable, regardless of your location, the climate, the building type. And I don't think enough people are aware of the principles, and the principles would actually tie you back to the ecology a lot better, more directly. And they aren't tied to any one design pattern. And so I think understand those principles could be really helpful in like tying people to the place.
We're used to patterns and principles when it comes to urban design, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Kevin Lynch, the whole idea of cities being edges and nodes and landmarks. I mean, this was urban design 101, right? We're taught this in school. Why aren't we taught the same thing for ecology?
I've also been a critic of the architectural education insofar as like I feel like students should be learning about site and understanding what the concept of changing that site, it really the impact of that before you even learn about architectural concepts and all the but changing that system is there's so much that students already have to learn, that the idea of trying to introduce yet more information is that's a whole nother level of undertaking that would take a long time.
That sort of cross-disciplinary teaching is not uncommon in architecture. I mean, we are taught in undergraduate school structural design, but that doesn't mean we're going to be structural engineers. It facilitates an understanding of how building structures work, and then eventually in practice, how to have a conversation with the structural engineer.
That's right.
I said at the start of the conversation that through your work and your research, you are, in a sense, challenging the conventional wisdom on buildings and landscapes and cities, and you implicitly seek to blur the boundaries between the human-made and the natural. And I think that if we blur the boundary between the human-made and the natural, we are also blurring the boundaries of professional roles and liabilities, right? So is the nature-centric design the responsibility of the architect or the landscape architect, or is it indeed both? Or is there a third discipline that needs to come out of this? How do you persuade and educate your clients and the project teams? Catie?
Well, it often depends on how we're brought on. If we're brought on by the client, it's one dynamic. If we're brought on by, say, the architect, it can be completely different, and it depends on what stage. Obviously, sooner is better because then there's the opportunity is greater. But it also is an opportunity to bring a whole team together rather than just the architect. So almost always when we are brought on early, almost always it's to provide some context that everyone can relate to. So introducing the idea of ecosystem services or the site performance or the human impact, like whatever angle is appropriate for that project or the client, or even just presenting an array of potential directions and see what people latch onto. But ultimately, it's really trying to understand what the client's and the various team members' goals or priorities are, and then finding a language that unites them all. And oftentimes, that environmental performance can be one of those uniting factors that support some sort of design continuity across disciplines. And I think that's really exciting when everyone can work together. It's not just about what it looks like and how it performs in general, but like this idea of the storytelling that can come out of it. And I know we were talking initially at the very beginning of this about how, we want to move beyond storytelling, but I think storytelling is actually vital to getting that broader awareness and buy-in. And the question is how do we get the right stories being told to the right people? Oftentimes, it's the mediocre stories that get a lot of attention.
Right. Anuj, what do you do?
I think it starts with that shared understanding, because we work very closely with just the sustainability teams, and more often than not, it's almost working complementarily, where the sustainability team would be looking at, say, the temperature performance, and then we'd be working with the landscaping team and saying, how do you actually increase the performance of the landscape, developing all these metrics, and then there'd be this back and forth. Does greenery amplify the the thermal performance, the energy performance, where's the water coming from? Does it help nature? Does it help meet our sustainability goals? So then it very quickly translates to, the net zero paradigms that, is being talked about. So then it becomes bigger and broader, and then we have to align again on the vocabulary. And then very often, I find it's also what we start with versus what we end up with, can be very different, because as you said, there is this euphobic idea of, nature, that I will just plant trees and then suddenly nature will come and there'll be this beautiful song all around, until we actually go into the detailed design and construction stage, and then be like, oh, I needed to do this. And then
Yeah.
like, oh, I'm not willing to do this, and therefore I need to change the numbers. Are we ready for that? So there are those difficult conversations that need to be happen as well. Yeah. So again, I think if we come in early, we align on vocabularies, we align on the vision, and we make sure that actually everyone at the decision-making level is informed about what we're creating, and we are not being kind of put in a silo that, hey, Anuj, the ecologist should just talk to the landscape architect and you do your thing, and that'll never work.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, because that is the best way to that early conversation where everyone's involved and has some sort of ownership in the process and the solutions. You're going to have a much more integrative the solution or outcome for your building, and then it can't be cost engineered out. The biophilia or the biocentric design solution, like, it's much harder to cut them out when they can't be individually, like, itemized on a list. So when the solution for one thing is supporting the solution for another and another and another, the Port of Portland airport terminal is a great example of that. The roof design made of mass timber was addressing like the actual design outcome was much greater than what we had originally thought it might be, because it ended up addressing biophilic design, carbon goals, local economy goals, daylighting expectations, and supporting the indoor plant life. So there were so many things that it was integrated with as a solution that we couldn't just say, oh, well, we're not going to use wood, or that wasn't an option. So I think when you can get projects together or get teams together to come up with really integrative solutions, then you have a much better chance of actually having an end result that is more aligned with your goals, whether it is or isn't what you expected it to be from the beginning.
I'd like to add something. We found it really important to actually bring the facility managers in the conversation early on.
Yes.
Because, as we know...
yeah, they're the ones who have to make it work, right?
Yeah, right.
If they don't understand it or they don't agree with it, they're not going to maintain it.
And a lot of traditional design for maintainability discussion is about actually having the building clean and not have nature on it. We were looking at the guidelines for Singapore and design for maintainability, and they talk about removing bird nests and climbers as they're climbing on the walls and all that. And the facility managers almost had to be retrained in buildings like Kampung Admiralty, and we interviewed them and we scored how they function and all that, and they understand why this building is the way it is, and actually alter their practices. So there has to be that buy-in at a bigger level.
I always end with a question on each episode. What gives you hope? What gives you hope to keep going? Catie?
Well, I think just hearing great stories about what people are accomplishing or doing. I mean, I just last night I was talking to Eric Sanderson, the person we had worked with 15 years ago on understanding how Manhattan, the history of the ecology there. He's just said that they're coordinating with the Department of Environmental Protection, and they've mapped out 580 watersheds in New York City, and are overlaying that with like the just understanding the districts of the city and like how that might potential. I don't know exactly how it's going to be used, but the idea that like we could start thinking about our neighborhoods, our districts as based on watersheds or, what's going on, like that's exciting. I know it's not new, but that scale is, 580 watersheds. That gives you something to think about, like when you're building on a site. So those might seem like small efforts, but there are a lot of great people doing some pretty amazing stuff. And if we can start connecting those stories, I think we have a lot more hope of getting to that biocentric design.
Wonderful. Anuj?
It's the young people. I am in my mid-career, and if I look at people maybe just out of college or even, teenagers, they're darn smart. They know so much more than what I knew 20 years ago, right? Their worldview encapsulates, climate change, what's happening in this world, nature-centric design, and the extinction crisis, or at least the people who I've spoken with. They are speaking up, and no matter what policymakers are doing globally or who's getting elected, I think ground up, these people are in the workforce, they're challenging the norms, and, they're not afraid to speak up or, for that matter, start their own practices. That gives me hope, because they will eventually change how we're going.
Wonderful. It's been a great pleasure talking to you. And Catie, next time you're in Singapore, we insist you come by and we'll catch up with Anuj. Yeah.
Thank you so much for having us.
Not at all. Anuj, thank you. Always a pleasure.
You're welcome.
Wonderful.
Well, on that note, guys, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. Take care.
Thank you.
We'll catch up soon.
Bye.
Thanks also to you for joining in. If you've enjoyed today's conversation and haven't done so yet, please click the subscribe button on this screen to always know when a new episode is out. You can also follow Ecogradia on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, on Instagram and other social media, and subscribe to our newsletter on our website at ecogradia.com. Until we meet next, this is Nirmal signing off in Singapore.